Rounds. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Kevin Kilgore. Dr. Kilgore received his Bachelor of Science degree in Biomedical Engineering from the University of Iowa in 1983, and his master's and PhD degrees in Biomedical Engineering from Case Western Reserve University in 1987 and 1991, respectively. He's currently the P. Hunter Peckham and George J. Pica Professor of Biomedical Engineering in the Department of Orthopedics and Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at the Metro Health System and School of Medicine in the Case Western Reserve University. He's also biomedical engineering in the research service of the VA Northeast Ohio Healthcare System and is an associate director in the Cleveland Functional Electrical Stimulation Center. His research interests are in the clinical applications of functional electrical stimulation to provide hand and arm function for individuals with paralysis, implantable health monitoring, and electrical nerve conduction block for pain and spasticity control. He's also seeking to establish an open source implantable system for research use. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kilgore in a virtual round of applause. The floor is yours. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for the invitation from the south side of the Great Lakes. So I'm going to be talking about the work we've been doing in Cleveland for quite a while. I'm going to focus on the implanted neuroprostheses for spinal cord injury. And, you know, like any of this kind of work, there's a huge team in the background. And I'm guessing that many of these people are known to you. In particular, Dr. Hunter Peckham probably is known as he's been in this field for a long time. All right, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to make you guys be guinea pigs for an attempt to organize this talk a little bit differently than you might normally organize a talk, because I'm going to start with the end result, which is the clinical outcomes of our third generation implantable system. And I'll show you some videos of the function that we're getting today. And then I will work backwards and provide a relatively brief description of the technology itself, the implanted technology, give you some idea of why we designed it the way we did. It's a modular system, so it makes it a little bit unique in the world of implantable devices. And then I'm going to work way back and talk about the success and failure of our first generation system. It's probably, it may be a story that at least some of you are somewhat familiar with, but I thought I'd go through that. I know that all of you guys are very interested in translation, and this is at least one of our experiences in translation in the area of spinal cord injury and implantable devices. And then I'm just going to wrap up with a couple slides on how this past experiences affect the things that we are working on currently. So if you have questions, please feel free to interrupt if there's points of clarification, but I will also just stop briefly at the end of each one of these topics and see if there's any questions on that particular topic. All right, so first we're going to talk about the clinical outcomes of our implantable neuroprosthesis. Just by way of introduction, I think probably everyone on this call knows about functional electrical stimulation. I'm not going to go into too many details. I'll just say that when I use the term neuroprosthesis, which I don't know if it's universally used in this way, but I'm talking about a system that uses electrical stimulation to provide function. And it's a prosthesis as opposed to a rehabilitation device or recovery device. So let's say in contrast to like epidural stimulation for spinal cord injury, which is typically you might think of as being applied in a temporary way with the idea that it might produce recovery of function. Unfortunately, our system does not produce any recovery of function, at least changes in the biology. The function is produced directly by the stimulation. So when the stimulation is off, the individual goes back to being paralyzed. And when the stimulation is on, they gain the function and have control over it. And so a second important aspect of our systems is that the user has direct control over the stimulation. So if you're using the neuroprosthesis for hand function or standing or bladder function, you need to have voluntary control over that activity. So that's unlike, say, a spinal cord stimulator or a deep brain stimulator, for example, that would typically be just turned on and left on, and they would run in the background. In our case, the user is has very intimate control over how the stimulation is being used. So they become a very important part of whether these systems work or not. I am going to be talking about implanted neuroprostheses, and I know that Milos and others have done a lot of work in developing surface stimulation devices in the past. We like the implanted neuroprostheses for long-term function, primarily because of the high predictability of the results. So every day the response is the same because of the implanted electrodes. And we've also worked hard, and I'll show you a little bit of this, but we've worked hard to try to make sure that the system is simple to put on and put off. And actually, in our current third generation device, there really is nothing to wear, nothing to have to put on. And so that's a pretty important aspect for us. Of course, the big disadvantage of implanted neuroprostheses is that they are invasive. They require surgery. Surgery is not for everyone. And particularly in spinal cord injury, that's a definite concern. So it definitely provides function, but it's definitely not the kind of thing that every individual is going to want to undergo. This probably is not necessary, but just so you know, and in part so I don't forget to tell you this, all of the videos that I'll be showing today are videos of people with a complete spinal cord injury, usually traumatic spinal cord injury, I think in all cases. And they all have a motor complete injury at either C5 or C6. So they all have some function in their shoulder, deltoid, trapezius, and so on are fairly strong. Biceps is strong. They can at least bring their hand to their face. And for those who are at the C6 level, they can also extend their wrist. But obviously, fingers and thumb are paralyzed. Most forearm muscles are paralyzed. Triceps is paralyzed. And of course, all the muscles and functions below the shoulder level and chest level are also paralyzed. So this, I thought I'd start out with this because it seems like every talk on spinal cord injury research starts out with this graph. Kim Anderson, who's part of our group here in Cleveland, published this a long time ago. And, you know, people use it to show that if they're working on hand and arm function like I am, they say, look how high of a priority this function is to people who have tetraplegia. And bladder and bowel is important. Trunk stability is important. Sexual function is important. So usually this is used to try to focus on a particular intervention that's being supplied. But I would say that what people with spinal cord injury really want is not to have to make this kind of a choice. In other words, they don't want to have to choose arm function from trunk stability from walking. They would like to be able to have all of those functions and more if those things are available. We think that our implanted technology can do basically all of these functions, except possibly for chronic pain. Not right now, but many of these functions we can provide right now. So we're trying to produce and implement a multifunction implanted system. And as I list here, we're starting with a system that provides grasp, reach, posture, and standing for people with C5, C6, motor complete spinal cord injury. And that's what I'll show you here. So these are the functions that are provided, at least in terms of broad categories. And the implanted system I will come back to. It's shown on the left here. But what I'm going to show you are the videos of each of these different functions. So first, to start out with, what I'm showing here is the way that an individual controls the opening and closing of their grasp. And so right now the individual is using EMG control from their brachioradialis. And so when they fire their brachioradialis, we stimulate the muscles to close their hand. And then when they relax their brachioradialis, we stimulate the muscles to open their hand. And so from a functional standpoint, it works very much like very much like their tenodesis grip, except that when they relax, they get stimulated hand opening. And then when they pull their wrist back, they get stimulated finger and thumb closing for their, in this case, for a lateral pinch. The other thing I'll just briefly mention is we often combine these procedures with tendon transfers. And so in this particular case, this individual who has a C5 level injury, he doesn't have any voluntary wrist extension. We did a tendon transfer of his brachioradialis to the ECRB, to the wrist extensor. So that's how he's getting his wrist extension in this case, through voluntary tendon transfer of a voluntary muscle. And then we're adding the electrical stimulation on top of that. He also has a smartphone interface sitting in his lap. That's what he uses to turn the stimulation on and off in this particular case. So here's an example of him using his implanted system to eat some ice cream, basically holding a spoon. I point out that it's ice cream because this is not that soft, so it takes a reasonable amount of force. He has to hold the spoon with quite a bit of force. And, you know, that's one of the big advantages of the electrical stimulation systems. You can, assuming that the muscles are available, you can get a pretty strong pinch. Probably not quite as strong as before their injury, but certainly strong enough to do most activities of daily living. So provides a pretty significant benefit. And using a spoon or using a fork are the most common activities that people use the implanted system for once they received it. So that's the lateral pinch where the thumb comes against the index finger. We also provide a palmar grasp where the thumb is abducted and the fingers are extending. So here's an example of, now this particular individual has a C6 level spinal cord injury, so she has wrist extension. But we're using the stimulation here to provide the opposition between index long fingers and her thumb. So this is the kind of a task, you know, popcorn is light enough that potentially with just a passive tenodesis, you might be able to pick it up. but that only works if your fingers and thumb happen to come together at exactly the right way, which is pretty difficult to control. So one advantage that we have with the stimulation is we can stimulate a variety of different muscles. In this particular case, we're relying pretty heavily on the finger intrinsic muscles. That's what really enables her fingers to have the direct opposition to her thumb. And then she's controlling it with wrist EMG in this particular case. So now I'm going to show a very brief video of overhead reach. So obviously people at the C5, C6 level do not have elbow extension. We can stimulate their triceps. In this particular case, we have the stimulation on when he reaches up. That's what enables him to extend his arms above his head. And then we turn the stimulation off. In his right hand, you can see how it drops down to his head. So we can combine the stimulation of triceps with stimulation for grasp, opening, and closing. And so people can, for example, reach up on a shelf and get an object up off of a shelf that's above their head. And obviously a task that normally would be pretty difficult for someone at this level of injury. Now a video on seated postural stability. People at this level of injury are pretty unstable. Usually they're wearing maybe a seat belt or sometimes a chest strap to try to maintain posture in their chair, but that's pretty limiting in terms of reach and things like that. So what we're comparing here is this individual's movement, and he also has a C5 complete motor injury. With the stimulation on, his trunk stimulation on versus stimulation off. So when his stimulation is off, his trunk is pretty floppy. Also, if you ask him to do simple things, like here we asked him to raise his arms as high as he could, he doesn't raise very high because he's afraid he's going to tip over. And now when we turn the trunk stimulation on, he can reach quite a bit higher because he knows his trunk is stable, he's not going to fall over. He can also reach from side to side. So in this case, what we're stimulating are the back extensors bilaterally, and also hip extensors as well. And that provides the posture control. Now this is sitting up from a forward lean. So again, at this level of injury, if someone leans a little too far forward, they're trying to reach something a little bit too far on a table or off the floor or something like that, and they lose their balance, they will fall forward and basically have their chest on their knees, and they'll be stuck in that position until someone comes and helps them back up. And so with the stimulation of the back extensors, we can raise someone back up from a forward lean in that position. And so again, that's control, could be controlled by EMG control, it could be controlled by switches. There's a variety of options that we can provide for people so that if they get stuck in that forward lean position, they can trigger the stimulation for back extension. Having the trunk stability also provides improved wheelchair propulsion. And here's a video that shows this. This first part of the video is the stimulation is off. And you can see how when she tries to push, her trunk is floppy, and so it's difficult. Here's the stimulation is off again. So now you can see every time she pushes it, it pushes her from one side to the other. And now we turn the stimulation, her trunk stimulation on, and her trunk is stable, and it's much easier for her to push in that case. And this is without, this doesn't include stimulation of triceps in this particular video. So this is just stimulation of trunk, helps improve her ability to propel her manual wheelchair. Standing transfer. I wish I could tell you that we were providing independent stand with balance and everything like that, but we're not that advanced yet. But we can provide standing that is really more, this is more of a benefit to the individual's caregiver than it is to them, although certainly standing is a benefit to the person who's standing. But what we're doing in this case is stimulating hip extensors and knee extensors. So the stimulation will come on here right there. That's the stimulation coming on. And so it's her hip and knee extensors that are lifting her body weight. And so her husband, who's her caregiver in this particular case, he doesn't have to lift her body weight. What he has to do is provide her with balance. So you can see that when she first stands up, he's providing the balance for her so that she doesn't tip over, but he doesn't have to lift her body weight when that happens. And then he rotates her, and then the stimulation is timed to turn off at a certain time, and that's what allows her then to sit back down. This particular activity is triggered through the smartphone, just a switch on the smartphone, and then the action is just timed in this particular case. All right, so we are hoping, we initiated a clinical study of this hand and trunk system. We are going to, as far as a multi-center study, we're focusing on the hand first. We feel like that's more straightforward to implement at the present time, and then we'll add the trunk later. We do have a modular system that I'll be showing you in just a moment that allows us to add these functions later. So if someone gets a hand system now, then we can add the trunk later as part of a future study. We're also looking to expand these functions. We're looking to provide bladder and bowel function. Those are, that activity is already ongoing, of course, but we want to add that into this same third generation system. Also cough function and health monitoring, particularly focusing on warning people regarding autonomic dysreflexia, but there's certainly other health monitoring benefits for people with spinal cord injury. So I'm going to stop there for a minute and just see if there's any questions before I go further and talk a little more detail about the technology. Okay, so let's see here. There. Okay. So our technology that we have developed, this is our what I referred to as our third generation technology. It is a modular system which allows us to customize the different components depending on the needs of the particular person. Obviously, we have focused on spinal cord injury, and so we developed this with spinal cord injury in mind initially, but we think that it has broader application beyond spinal cord injury, certainly for stroke and MS, but also for other autonomic functions, any kind of system that requires sensors and stimulation together. We think that this provides a pretty good approach, at least for early feasibility studies. So the components here are the power module, which is the larger module shown on the left, and then what we refer to globally as remote modules, these smaller modules here on the right, which can be placed throughout the body. And there is a network connection, a wired network connection that provides power and communication to these remote modules. So the power module has lithium-ion rechargeable batteries in it that provides power through to the whole system. So there are no batteries inside of these smaller modules here. And we'll talk a little bit about why we took that kind of approach. Let's see, there's a question here about can this technology work with the peripheral nerve transfer in the upper limb? And the answer is yes. In fact, we have just started, and nerve transfers in spinal cord injury haven't been as common until probably the last 5 years or so, something like that. And so we are starting to combine we've always combined tendon transfers, but now also nerve transfers and the implanted electrical stimulation. In general, though, what you want to do is after the nerve transfer is wait, typically about a year or so, to see what function is recovered, and then the electrical stimulation can provide whatever is still lacking after the nerve transfers have been completed. Okay, so this is an example of how this system might be implanted, and this would be with someone for spinal cord injury. The power modules typically located in the abdomen. It's larger than the other components, so that makes a good spot for it. Also, it makes it easier to do the recharge for this device, to recharge those lithium-ion batteries, rechargeable batteries. And then the different remote modules, which include stimulation and EMG recording, are placed, can be placed really anywhere in the body, certainly in the arms, legs, abdomen, in the forearm. They're probably too big to be placed in the hand or foot, but otherwise can be placed wherever the target location is. So whichever muscles are being stimulated, it can be placed near those muscles to try to minimize electrode links and things like that. Okay, so I'm gonna just show you real quickly a few diagrams of different ways in which this modular system might be configured. Here's a configuration for hand function. So this module up on the chest is recording the EMG function. I showed you that we typically use wrist EMG as a control source. We also use platysma pretty commonly, which is a facial grimacing muscle. It actually works well as a switch control. So EMG recording from the chest here, and then these modules with the red leads coming from them are stimulators. They can stimulate, each one can stimulate 4 different muscles. And so depending on the number of muscles we need, we can add multiple modules in the forearm, we can add them in the upper arm, and so on, to stimulate the different muscles that we're targeting. Here's an example of what would be a cough system or epidural stimulation system, where the electrodes are placed in the back or in the spine. Here's the system configuration for lower extremity, standing and walking. This would be for someone with paraplegia, and stimulation of hip and knee extensors, and even some of the ankle muscles. Here's a example of how this might be configured for bladder function. This one we haven't implemented yet. So here we would be activating the pudendal nerves and sacral roots as part of a bladder system. So those are theoretical. Here's what we've done so far, which is to implement the system for grasp, reach, trunk, and standing in cervical C5, C6 motor complete SCI. We typically use and stimulate 24 different muscles, 12 in the hand, in one hand and arm, and then 12 muscles, 6 on each side for the trunk. So that includes back extensors and hip extensors, and in some cases, knee extensors as well. We also record from 2 different muscles that are under voluntary control. So we record the myoelectric signal. Typically, that is a wrist extensor and the platysma, the neck muscle. We have implanted power, as I mentioned, it's rechargeable. In general, people have to recharge every day. It takes about an hour and a half. So people usually recharge in the evenings if they're sitting and watching TV or working at a desk or something like that. They just recharge while they're doing that. They could also recharge while sleeping, but at least so far in our experience, people just tend to do it in the evening. It's just a little bit easier. There are also sensors in every module, temperature and acceleration, which can be an advantage. We haven't made a lot of use of this yet, but that's certainly coming in the future. And there is distributed processing in each module. I'll talk a little about that as we go through it. The external components for functional use, there's nothing to wear here, but obviously in order to do the recharging, we use an inductive link. So the individual has to have the coil placed on the outside of the chest to do recharging of the batteries through the inductive link. So typically they can just set that on their lap. It will recharge while they're doing other tasks. And then we have a wireless link to the power module that allows us to do programming. So when they're in the lab and we're programming the patterns for the different functions, grasp, trunk, etc., that's all programmed and then stored inside the body in each one of these modules. We can do a lot of reprogramming of the system from the outside. We can change the control schemes and things like that. So there's a lot of flexibility with the system. As you can imagine, that made the regulatory bodies, in our case, the FDA, it made them very uncomfortable, but we explained how we do this, and we did get approval to do these early feasibility studies that you saw the videos on. I thought I would talk a little about why we designed this system the way we did. So we have a modular system. We used a wired network. We have batteries in this one large component. And why did we design it that way? And I'll just say that, I'd be happy to talk with anyone, after this in great detail about our process in making this design. But really, we started with the electrode tissue interface because in order for these systems to work, you have to reliably be able to activate the target muscles selectively and in a graded fashion so that you can provide things like grasp opening and closing and trunk function and so on. So we did not want, that has been working for us using our existing electrodes for the last, really since the 90s, I guess the last 30 years. And so we did not want to change that. But we did want to put everything else inside the body, including the powering and the processing. An important aspect for us is this third bullet point, which is the surgical installation and repair. We think it's very important to expect and anticipate that every technical device is going to have a failure at some point. And it needs to be designed such that it is easy for a surgeon to go in and repair these, either replace or fix a particular component if it fails. And so that was a key aspect. And I'll show you one of the key parts which led us to have a centralized power source rather than putting the power distributed throughout these different modules. And we want to simplify daily use. That's why we put the batteries and the processing inside so that there's nothing that the individual has to wear. Once the system is charged up, they can use it all day without having to have any external components. We do give them the smartphone interface because everyone seems to have a smartphone these days, and that seems to work quite well for them. So here's one of this is not real data. I should just, as a caveat here, this is based on real data, but these lines are just drawn to as illustrative purposes here. But what we did was look at the different components and what is reasonable. So the hermetic enclosures, the electronics, even the leads can typically be designed such that they will last 50 years inside the body, just as a rough estimate. Unfortunately, the individual with spinal cord injury, if they're implanted with this system in their 20s or 30s, they're not likely to live more than 50, 60 years with this implanted system. But the one component that is absolutely going to fail, and probably is going to fail multiple times during the lifetime of the user, is the rechargeable battery. So in our case, and this is similar to, say, a DBS implant or a spinal cord stimulator, the battery component is going to have to be replaced. So we designed that with a single power module that's in the abdomen. There are two connections to it, so you surgically open that up. You'd disconnect two leads and put the new system in. And we've had experience now doing this in replacing these power modules, and it is a straightforward surgery in the same way that it happens in deep brain stimulation. So that was one of the reasons why we didn't put batteries in these remote modules, because that would require them to also be replaced. And we looked across a variety of different alternatives. In the end, we settled on this diagram. This is in a book chapter somewhere. I can give you the reference if people are interested, but we settled on a wired network for a variety of reasons, as well as a centralized power source. So let's see, there looks like there's a few questions. I'm sorry. Let me answer a few of these questions. So for a single system, trunk, hand function, actually any of the functions provided, each system only needs a single power module. So the power module is sufficient to power all of the remote modules on the network. Right now, the current power module can power, I think, a maximum of 9 remote modules, or at least 9. It really has to do with, in that case, battery life and how often you would like to recharge the system. The systems that we've been implanting in people typically consist of 7 remote modules. That provides the hand and trunk and standing functions. So it's certainly possible to provide additional power if needed. And then there's a question about the surgery. Yeah, so the surgery is an intensive surgery, and as I mentioned, it is not for everyone. The implantation procedures are about 6 hours. That includes, actually, most of that time is spent placing the electrodes, connecting up the modules, placing the modules and connecting them. Typically does not take a long time. That's maybe an hour or less out of that surgery, but most of the time is spent placing the electrodes and making sure that they stimulate the right muscles. And it is done under general anesthesia. The question also is the surgery always successful? I'll show you some data about that. But the quick answer is yes, it is always successful, at least so far. A question here about do users have access to change the intensity of the stimulation? And the answer is yes. So they can they can adjust, but not on an individual electrode basis. They're adjusting the entire grasp pattern. So they can control grasp opening and closing in a patterned way, but they don't control individual muscles. We don't have enough EMG sources yet to for them to control each muscle on its own. In the interest of time, I'm just going to point out one or two things about each one of these modules. The power module has lithium-ion rechargeable cells. It has a wireless link for programming, as I mentioned. Maybe the more important parts of the technology are the remote modules. So the stimulator module can stimulate 4 different muscles up to a 20 milliamp pulse, 255 microseconds. So that is more than enough to activate muscle-based electrodes, and it certainly can activate nerve-based electrodes in the body. The EMG sensor is primarily the signal processing is software-based. We have a pretty significant gain range, and then that information is processed in the EMG module, and then it's placed on the network for use by the other modules for control. So when an individual is using their wrist EMG, that signal is processed, put on the network, and then used by the stimulator modules to stimulate the appropriate muscles. And then we used our standard electrodes. Again, these have been used in humans for more than 20 years now, and so we decided not to change those, although the general technology could certainly take advantage of some of the newer electrode technology that's emerging now. A lot of time is spent on connectors and making connectivity work. That's a very difficult technology. This shows our connector pin. This is in surgery. Here's a remote module, and we're connecting an electrode that's going to be connected, plugged into this port here. And then just to take this view a little bit further back, here are 2 electrodes that have been plugged in, these red connections. 2 more electrodes will be plugged into this module, and these red connections up here. And then the blue connection is the network connection. So that goes to the module that's up in the upper arm in this particular case. I should have said this is a forearm. I don't know if that's obvious from the picture here, but then the network cables go up to the eventually to the power module in the abdomen. And then for the network communication, we use the controller area network standard, which is a pretty commonly utilized network communication structure, and that works actually quite well for this particular application. And our first human implant was in January of 2016. We've implanted 7 individuals to date, 2 of those in the last year. We had about a 3-year hiatus where there was something called a pandemic that kind of disrupted things, but we also had some technical issues that we had to work out. We did a revision on our network communication, and then we started new implants starting in January of 2023. All right, any other questions? Anything that I've missed at this point? I'll talk very briefly about the success and failure of our first generation system now. Okay, so this is the freehand system, which is our first generation system. We could stimulate 8 different muscles. It was focused totally on hand function, invented by Hunter Peckham, whom probably many of you know, Mike Heath and others here in Cleveland. This is an example of the stimulator. This This did not have any batteries inside, no processing inside. That was all done outside. So through an inductive link, so the user had to wear the coil taped to their chest all the time in order to use this. Here's an example of the device implanted. These discs here are the electrodes on the different muscles in the forearm and hand. And it was controlled at that time. We hadn't developed the EMG control. This was in the late 80s and early 90s. So they used shoulder motion. This was taped onto the individual's chest. So quite a bit of hardware that had to be worn by the user in order to use their hand. And here's an example, but of using it. Stimulation is on the left side here. Stimulation is off on the right side. This individual was implanted in 1994. She's still a user of the system. She used to use it at work, but she's now retired, so she just uses it around the house. We did a multi-center trial to demonstrate safety and efficacy, and the primary outcome measure was looking at increased independence in activities of daily living. We had a variety of mandatory activities like eating with a fork, writing with a pen, picking up a cup to drink. And then individuals could also identify specific activities that they were important to them, like this individual wanted to use an electric shaver, picking up a phone. Obviously, nowadays, people want to use a smartphone interface. That would be a pretty common request. So here's the results. And someone asked if it always worked. So far, yes, it always works. And the reason that it always works is not that the technology is so great necessarily. It's that the screening, the ability to screen users prior to surgery using surface stimulation and using EMG recording from the surface, that's a very good predictor of the function that the individual will get once the device is implanted. So I guess I would just say that there's not much mystery here. So if we can stimulate the muscle from the skin surface, we're definitely going to be able to stimulate it from inside the body. So unless we had a total disaster with a technology that didn't work at all, we know that individuals will get strong grip because we can test that beforehand. And if an individual has stronger grip, they're likely to be more independent. And so that has proven to be true. This happens to show the first 28 patients. We did a different type of test on the remaining. There were 50 people who were implanted as part of this multi-center trial. And the trial was completed in 1997, had marketing approval in the US, and it was also sold in other countries throughout North America, Europe, Australia, and Asia at the time. The company that it was transferred to was called NeuroControl. And during the period of 1999 through 2001, they were averaging 1 implant per week. But in October of 2001, NeuroControl withdrew the freehand system from the market. And they decided to pursue the stroke market, which is about 10 times bigger. So they dumped all the products they had that were for spinal cord injury, including the freehand system as well as the bladder system, the FineTech bladder system. And unfortunately, they couldn't get FDA approval of their stroke system, and they ended up going out of business in 2007. So this was, as you can imagine, a big blow for us. We were pretty excited about this being marketed. The functional outcomes remained successful. And there were approximately 250 people who were implanted worldwide. We do not know. I don't think anyone knows the exact number because the company would never share this information with us. So we don't know the final number, but it was somewhere between 200 and 250. And one question, obvious question, is why in the world was it pulled from the marketplace if it worked? And there are a lot of, obviously it's a complicated story. There are a lot of issues. Certainly SCI is a small market, and it's difficult but not impossible to market implantable devices for people with spinal cord injury. There are other devices that have been successfully marketed and continue to be marketed for people with spinal cord injury. So all of these made it difficult, but not impossible. And I'm just going to show you one particular aspect of the process, of the, let's say, commercialization process that contributed to NeuroControl deciding to pull the freehand from the market. What this graph shows is a typical pattern of sales for, I used the bladder system and the freehand in Europe and then in the US, and the typical uptake. So it's very slow at the beginning. Over the course of many years, 5 years, even 10 years, to really get to substantial sales. And so an individual investor or company has to be extremely patient in this process. The dark green shows what happened with the freehand system. It basically followed exactly the same pattern as the bladder system had in Europe. Unfortunately, the red line here shows the expectations of sales for the investors in NeuroControl. So they were promised a significantly increased uptake, drastically different than what had happened with the bladder system, which is the most most similar type of technology. And when that didn't happen, they were obviously disappointed. They had mismatched expectations and decided to seek something that would give a return on investment in a much faster rate. So that's just one of those, one piece of information that contributed to ultimately NeuroControl taking this off of the market. So I just want to end with a couple slides here, but let me, before I do that, is there any final questions? And I see I'm up against the hour here.
I think I see, if I may jump in, there are two questions, one from Dr. Parveen Eftekhar and one from Dr. Arash Arami. Do you see them in the Q&A?
Oh, right. Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
So I provide EMG triggered FES to the recipient muscles and wonder if your system could collaborate with the recipient muscles stimulation. So we use blanking for in order to get EMG and stimulation to work together. We have not yet tried stimulation in the same muscle that we're recording EMG signal from. I will say that we do place our recording electrodes in the wrist extensor muscles, and we stimulate finger extensors, EDC, for example. So, our stimulation is applied within a few centimeters of where we're recording. But we have a pretty highly processed EMG signal, and we throw away probably about a third of the signal due to the blanking. But we're still able to get a sufficient signal for control. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but we haven't tried to stimulate and record from the same muscle yet. And then we have EMG sensors for each muscle. Have you implemented a closed loop stimulation? So in our case, I would just say that the closed loop is by the user. So, right, so the user has voluntary control from the EMG signal via the EMG signal to the stimulation, to the grasp opening and closing. And so for something like hand function, you can't really have an automatic closed loop control. You might think about doing something like slip detection and force generation in the grasp. And those have been tried in the past, but it's proven to be pretty difficult to try to implement that. So that's not something we've implemented in this third generation system. So it's all under voluntary control by the user. All right, so it looks like I'm out of time, so I'll just I'm going to skip to the end here. And our current strategy, which involves combining a nonprofit with a for-profit, is certainly not the standard commercial product process. Whether this can work remains to be determined. So we're working at it, but the alternative, which was giving up on spinal cord injury and giving up on the function that people obtain, didn't seem acceptable to us. So we are pushing ahead, but maybe in 5 years from now, we'll have to say, we'll give you the answer as to whether this works or doesn't work. So, all right. Sorry, I went a little bit long there, but if there's any final questions, I'll take them, or certainly I could take questions by email later.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for a very engaging talk. And thank you for answering questions throughout the talk and also at the end. If there are any other questions, please type them in the Q&A. And while we wait, I have a quick question. So you mentioned some of the important challenges in commercialization and why the company had to stop providing a service. Is there anything research can do to improve the system to help with that, or is it mostly the commercial side of things that determine how?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, for example, one of the things that we did is the reason we went, one of the reasons we went to a modular system was to try to design a technology that would be more broadly applicable, say beyond even spinal cord injury, to stroke and to some of these autonomic disorders. And with the idea being that effectively makes the market bigger, right? So at least for the technology itself, we thought that by having the market expand beyond spinal cord injury, that would help. Whether that really works or not, that's still not clear. I think, that's going to be a difficult question. We do feel like we do have a commercial partner who's doing the manufacturing now. And so that's a benefit, and we feel like that's probably pretty stable. But that still doesn't solve the issue of making it available to people with spinal cord injury. So, yeah, I wish I knew the answer for what we could do to try to help, people in spinal cord or any of these, orphan markets, small markets, where it's pretty expensive. Let's see. It looks like there's a question here. Has it been used in the lower limb muscles for incomplete SCI? Yeah, so we have focused on complete SCI primarily until recently, mostly because it makes the outcome measures very clear. But certainly this is applicable to people with incomplete spinal cord injury for assistance in standing, assistance in walking and stepping, things like that. We have not yet implemented the networked neuroprosthesis in incomplete SCI for walking, but that's definitely coming. That's definitely one of those things that we want to do in the fairly near future. All right, I think that's it.
Thank you, everyone. Let's thank our speaker in another virtual round of applause.
All right. Thank you
Thank you
very
so
much.
much.
Right.
Thank you.